Welcome back to the Psyche and Singularity series. I've been going over my book, Psyche and Singularity, Jungian Psychology and Holographic String Theory. In this episode, I will be going over the historical evolution from Dante through Descartes, David Hume, and Immanuel Kant. I'm showing the philosophical history leading to Carl Jung's theory of the archetype of the self, which Jung admits is really his reinterpretation of Plato's theory of the absolute ideas, culminating with the idea of the good. In the previous videos, I showed the strong parallels between Plato's cosmology and the holographic string theory cosmology presented by Leonard Susskind and his partner Gerard 't Hooft. I showed also how Carl Jung's near-death experience of the cosmic horizon is extremely similar to the holographic string theory cosmology. And for a very brief review of that, according to Suskind's holographic string theory, all of the information that describes the past, the present, and the future of the three-dimensional volume of the universe is stored at each point of the surrounding sphere where space-time is expanding away from us at the speed of light. It's recorded at each point there, and it radiates back in to create this cinematic hologram, this holographic movie of space-time on fundamental, vibrating, elastic threads. That's the strings of string theory. In the previous video, I showed how St. Augustine, in his Confessions, propagated this Platonic cosmology, and it lasted as the worldview of the Western mind for over 1,000 years. In this video, I'm showing how Dante Alighieri maintained this fundamentally Platonic cosmology. It had been adopted by St. Augustine and then St. Thomas Aquinas, who fused it with parts of Aristotle's philosophy. But Aristotle inherited his cosmology from Plato's cosmology. So the Platonic and Aristotelian cosmologies are very similar, at least in the big picture, with the soul in the central point that encompasses the outermost sphere. So I'm just going to start to read a little bit here from the chapter on Dante, Descartes, Hume, and Kant. So according to the cultural historian Richard Tarnas, who I've been quoting, who I quote throughout the book, Dante realized in his epic poem La Divina Commedia what was in effect the moral, religious, and cosmological paradigm of the medieval era. So, for the sake of pointing out parallels with Suskind's cosmology, the most important point about Dante's cosmology, presented in the Commedia, and especially in the third part of it, the Paradiso, is his vision of the throne of God, the Empyrean, existing as a point on the outermost sphere of the universe. So I will read a little bit here from the Harvard mathematician Robert Osterman, who got his PhD in mathematics from Harvard and formerly served as chair of the Department of Mathematics at Suskind's own Stanford University. Robert Osterman was also raised in the Bronx, just like Susskind. So he explains that, and this is a quote, "The Big Bang occupies the position where Dante placed a point of light radiating with great intensity." So Robert Osterman shows that the gravitational singularity from which the Big Bang exploded is contained also at each point of the encompassing sphere of the cosmos, and he showed how similar that is to Dante's cosmology. I think that's enormously important for my purposes because I'm trying to say that Leonard Susskind, with the intention of obviating all intelligent design cosmologies, recreated what is inherently, or essentially it seems to me, a Platonic cosmology that was carried on through the Western world, primarily by Augustine, culminating with Dante's poem, and that cosmology then collapsed in the wake of Copernicus's theory, and now finally I'm saying it's reemerging accidentally from Susskind's holographic string theory. So when we see that Robert Osterman says that this Platonic cosmology that was reproduced by Dante shows that the Big Bang occupies the point where Dante showed the throne of God to be, that is a very strong support for my whole theory. So this is what Dante says when he sees this point of the Empyrean. He says, "O abounding grace, by which I dared to fix my look on the eternal light so long that I spent all my sight upon it. In its depths I saw that it contained, bound by love in one volume, that which is scattered in leaves throughout the universe, substances and accidents and their relations as it were fused together in such a way that what I tell of is a simple light. I think I saw the universal form of this complex, because in telling of it I feel my joy expand. Thus my mind all rapt was gazing, fixed, still, and intent, and ever enkindled with gazing. At that light one becomes such that it is impossible for him ever to consent that he should turn from it to another sight, for the good, which is the object of the will, is all gathered in it." So, the good, which is the object of the will, is all gathered in it. Plato's idea of the good, the ultimate vision to be had if you want to have a prudent life, either privately or publicly, you must see this idea of the good, the spiritual sun from which all of the absolute ideas emerge, and then from those absolute ideas, all of the physical forms and concepts we experience radiate from them. So everything can be reduced back into the idea of the good from which everything expands. That is what Dante is saying he saw out at the outermost sphere of the cosmos, which is, again, powerful support for my equation, which is just translating Carl Jung's equation of Psyche equals highest intensity in the smallest space. That was his leap day letter that I talked about previously, that can be translated as Psyche equals singularity. So the soul, the supreme soul at the outermost sphere of the universe. I also want, later in the book, I go over these parallels again when I go over the Riemann sphere, which is the mathematical model and the mathematical tool Einstein used to develop his general theory of relativity. Talking about Dante's idea of God, the philosopher Rudy Rucker, he says that beyond the outermost sphere of angels lies a point called the Empyrean, which is the abode of God. So he explains that how can this Empyrean be a single point which somehow also encompasses the entire sphere of the universe? And he says this problem can be remedied if we take space to be hyperspherical. This is a reference to the Riemann sphere. So he explains that if one lets a sphere expand in hyperspherical space, there comes a time when the circumference of the sphere turns into a point and disappears. Robert Osterman comments on the same parallels. That ancient cosmology is also regularly supported by people's near-death experiences, where they feel themselves expanding through space at an accelerating rate until they see themselves hurtling through a dark tunnel toward a point of infinitely bright and all-loving light that encompasses all of space and time. That seems to be what Dante is describing, and it correlates to the gravitational singularity from which space-time emerged. So that was published, the Divina Commedia, which was originally just titled the Commedia. Dante started it in 1304. But then this earth-centric, the geocentric cosmology with this heavenly sphere encompassing the universe collapsed in the wake of Copernicus's theory that the Earth and all the other planets in our solar system orbit around the sun. So I'll read a little bit here from the book. From Plato through the entire span of the medieval era, the intellectual class imagined the universe as a series of concentric spheres with Earth at the center and the eternal ideas of God's creative mind condensed in an infinitely dense point of light that somehow encompasses the circumference of space-time from which the visible temporal world is born. However, Kepler, Galileo, and Newton each successively vindicated Copernicus's mid-16th century theory that the Earth and the other planets revolve around the central sun. So Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, and Newton, they were all seeing themselves carrying on the Christian quest to discover the ideas of God's mind, the ideas of God's creative mind. God's ideas are mathematical. God creates the universe according to these mathematical ideas in his mind, and that is what these famous mathematical astronomers and physicists were trying to discover. That was the religious motivation behind their quest. But when Copernicus put forward his heliocentric theory, which was then given a more precise mathematical form by Kepler, who saw the circular orbits as not perfect circles but ellipses, and then which was further supported by Galileo's observations with his telescope, and finally cemented with Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica, published in 1687. The theory of the Earth as the center of the universe and the encompassing horizon as this heavenly sphere collapsed. If the Earth isn't the center of the universe, then why should we believe in all this talk about these concentric spheres with God's throne occupying the outermost sphere? It doesn't seem to, there's no reason to believe in that if the foundation of it is incorrect. So I will also read a little bit from Richard Tarnas, who comments on this historical irony that this quest for the mathematical forms that describe the movements of the planets, it started with Plato, but then it seems to have destroyed Plato's cosmology of this outermost sphere. So just reading from The Passion of the Western Mind by Richard Tarnas, he says on page 292 and 293, mathematical patterning was simply in the nature of things, or in the nature of the human mind, and it was not interpreted in a Platonic light as giving evidence of an eternal, changeless world of pure spirit. Paradoxically, the Platonic philosophy had served as the sine qua non for a worldview that seemed directly to controvert the Platonic assumptions. So, the Platonic assumptions of this Christian, Aristotelian, Augustinian cosmology were undermined by Copernicus's heliocentric theory, which was vindicated ultimately by Isaac Newton. So then René Descartes was trying to give, using skeptical human reason as his foundation and not the Bible, he was trying to give reasons to believe still in God and the soul. René Descartes was one of the great mathematicians that paved the way for the scientific revolution, and in the book I discuss how he did that by establishing his very strictly dualistic worldview, according to which there are two substances in existence. There is spiritual substance and material substance. The unthinking world of material substance extended in space, and the spatially unextended world of thinking substances, which include God and human souls. So if something is extended in space, it's an unthinking substance. It has no soul. It has no thought. If something is thinking, then it cannot have any extension in space. According to Descartes, animals and plants are just machines made by God. It seems like they have souls, but he says they really don't, because he equates soul with reason. Animals don't have reason, therefore they don't have a soul. So what Descartes did was combine these opposing worldviews of Plato, who believed that the human soul and all souls are imprinted with all of the absolute ideas, these eternal absolute forms of knowledge. Descartes accepted that in relation to human beings. Humans have those, but then he adopted Democritus's materialistic atomism, which Plato rejected, according to which the rest of the universe is made of soulless little atoms floating in the void. The animals and the plants, they consist entirely of these soulless atoms that can be described with mathematical forms, and that human beings can use their reason to discover the mathematical forms that describe and can predict the movements of the soulless atoms. So for Descartes, the whole world is like a big, great clock made by God, and it ticks on by just like a machine, a soulless machine. But God is a soul, and humans have a soul, and when we die, our bodies will perish, but our souls will live on, according to René Descartes. What I think is most interesting to point out for the parallels with this holographic string theory, and especially the equation Psyche equals singularity, is that Descartes describes soul as unextended thinking substance. It has no extension in space. Neither does the gravitational singularity have any extension in space. So according to Descartes' worldview, his dualistic worldview, the gravitational singularity, if it exists, it must be a thinking substance because it exists and yet has no extension in space. And more than that, it is very similar to his definition of God. So according to Descartes, here's his definition of God. By the name of God, I understand an infinite substance, eternal, immutable, independent, omniscient, omnipotent, and by which I and all the other things which exist, if it be true that any such exist, have been created and produced. He adds that parenthetical statement about if it be true that any such exist, because he's also famous for saying we can't be sure that anything exists other than our own thinking self. Everything could be a dream or a hallucination created by some malignant demon. All we can know for sure is that we think. Even if everything else is a deception, at least we're being deceived. To deceive, you have to think. I think, therefore I am. Cogito ergo sum. So, but he's assuming if all the things we perceive in the world are real, then that's how he defines God. It's the source of all that, that it's also omniscient, omnipotent, eternal, immutable, and primarily unextended in space. It has no extension in space. That is the definition of gravitational singularity. It's omnipotent. It has infinite power. It's got infinite density. All of the universe is contained within it. It's omniscient in the sense that it contains all of the information from the past, the present, and the future. And it's unextended in space. So René Descartes' dualistic worldview that really gave a mathematical and philosophical framework for the scientific revolution, it's been blamed for the human being's rejection of a soul existing in animals and plants. It's this environmentally catastrophic worldview. Al Gore points out that in his book, Earth in the Balance. But if we take his definition of God and the soul and compare it to the mathematical physics that emerged from his work, then we see that his definition of God is a dead ringer for the gravitational singularity. Okay, so that was René Descartes. He was a rationalist philosopher, as I said, borrowing from Plato, although unlike Plato, he rejected a soul in animals and plants. Plato believed in reincarnation, and René Descartes explicitly rejected reincarnation. After Descartes came David Hume, the British empiricist David Hume. And he divided existence into two categories, or divided knowledge into two categories: matters of fact and relations of ideas. Matters of fact are empirical sense perceptions: sights, sounds, touches, tastes, and smells. That's the source of real knowledge, according to Hume. Empiricism means knowledge comes from sense perception. Relations of ideas, humans invent in our mind. We connect to these inherently unconnected sense perceptions to help us exist in the world. It's a useful fiction that our minds create. It's vitally useful, indispensable, and yet fictitious process that the human mind automatically, or not necessarily automatically, but at least through cultural training, we connect these unconnected sense perceptions, and what we see are these fundamental relationships, which Hume will say they're not fundamental because they're not observable by your sense perceptions. and he attacks especially the idea of cause and effect. I see an event A, such as a gun firing, and then I see event B, a bullet exiting the barrel of the gun. So I'm assuming that there's a causal connection between this explosion within the gun and the bullet shooting out of the gun. And Hume will say, for your daily purposes of living on Earth, you must see things that way in this necessary causal connection. But as a strict empiricist, you can't actually say you've ever seen a causal connection. The idea of cause and effect is just an idea. It's this theory that in your mind, and it can't be smelled or tasted or touched or heard or whatever the 5 sense perceptions are. So he's saying the idea of cause and effect is simply a fiction. Similarly, the ideas of space and time. You can't see space or smell it or hear it or touch it, or time. These are also fictions of the human mind. So David Hume points out that this same kind of a criticism applies to the idea of a self. So I'll go back now to the endnotes here, and I believe it's on page 300. And he says that if any impression gives rise to the idea of the self, that impression must continue invariably the same through the whole course of our lives, since self is supposed to exist after that manner. But there is no impression, constant and invariable. So the self, when he uses the word impression, he means sense impression. A sight is a photon impressing itself upon your eye. So a self is a continuous, unchanging thing. If it's a real thing, says Hume, then it must correspond to some continuous, uninterrupted sense perception. But there is no continuous and uninterrupted sense perception, he says. There's no sight or sound or taste or smell or touch that stays the same continuously forever. Therefore, there is no self. All the self really is a series of unconnected sense impressions and memories that, flickering memories that come and go. And if there's no continuity from one moment to the next of a self, then there is no self. It's a fiction. That philosophy that David Hume talked about is basically the same as the Buddhist philosophy of anatman, no self. Buddha rejected the Hindu theory of the Atman for these same reasons. Where is it? All I see or hear or touch are unconnected sense impressions. So Hume also says that as memory alone acquaints us with the continuance and extent of this succession of perceptions, it is to be considered upon that account chiefly as the source of personal identity. He's saying that the rapid succession of sense perceptions deludes us into the illusion that it's one continuous and uninterrupted stream of consciousness, like a movie. You've got the movie reels on a film glide past a projector light at a significantly rapid rate to create the illusion of one continuous movie. And that is what David Hume is saying is the cause for the illusion of the idea of a continuous, uninterrupted self. According to David Bohm, who was the first one to use holography to try to reconcile quantum mechanics and general relativity, all of the universe is flickering at an incredibly rapid rate, 10 to the 44 times a second, in and out of the quantum vacuum. So that is reminiscent of what David Hume was saying. But returning to the book here, I'm saying that David Hume's requirements for a self, this continuous, uninterrupted sense impression, as well as all of the memories being simultaneously experienced in a continuous and an uninterrupted way. That's what David Hume says you'd have to have if there was such a thing as a self. Well, that's a hard criteria he's providing us, but it is met by, for example, Carl Jung's near-death experience, where he said he felt all of the memories of his life simultaneously, as well as the past, the present, and the future of the whole universe, specifically out at the outermost sphere of the cosmos. So I'll just read here what I wrote in the book on page 93. I say, the indivisible simplicity and invariable constancy of the self that Hume demands is supplied, at least in theory, by the equation of the psyche with the gravitational singularity and the holographic horizon of the cosmos, which serves as the eternal memory bank of the universe, whereupon all sense impressions from the past, present, and future are interwoven at each point. That cosmic memory bank fulfills Hume's definition of what a self must be, and it is precisely what Jung said he encountered during his near-death experience. So the indivisible simplicity, that was another thing that Hume pointed out about the self. The self can't be a compound of other things. If it is one single enduring unit, then it must not have parts. It has to be this indivisible simplicity, says David Hume. But we see nothing that is indivisibly simple. Everything we perceive is compounded of other things. The only things that could maybe be called indivisible and simple are our sense impressions, but they're fleeting. They come and they go. But if you take into account the idea of the gravitational singularity and its relationship to the horizon of the cosmos, you have this indivisible, simple point, the infinitely dense singularity, and then the memory of all of your past, present, and future sense impressions are contained at each point of the horizon of the cosmos. So that is the self, I am saying in the book, that corresponds to Plato's idea of the good, which corresponds to Carl Jung's archetype of the self, and it satisfies Hume's demands for what you'd have to have in order for there to be a self. So moving from David Hume, I turn now to Immanuel Kant, born 1724, died 1804. So Kant tries to synthesize Hume's empiricism with the rationalism of Descartes and Plato by coming up with his theory of the a priori categories of thought. So he said that David Hume had awoken him from his dogmatic slumber. He made him question things. So yeah, it makes sense what you're saying, Hume. Matters of fact are empirical sense perceptions. I don't perceive cause and effect. I don't perceive space. I don't perceive time. Those are relations of ideas, figments of the human imagination. So what Kant will say is, I agree they are not matters of fact, but neither are they fictions that humans create. Rather, they are these lenses of perception that we're born with. These are inborn categories of thought, which is very similar to Plato's theory of the ideas imprinted on the soul. The difference being that Kant didn't say that these ideas are all contained necessarily in some supreme idea of the good or God, as Augustine had said previously. Kant says, even though he believed in God, he was trying to say, how much can just the unaided human reason, unaided by divine revelation, what conclusions can we come to about the nature of the self? And he said, well, we do have these inborn categories of thought, but for all we know, they only apply to human beings. They might not apply to other species. Certainly they don't necessarily apply to the whole. There's not necessarily a universal mind that sees things. These aren't necessarily God's absolute ideas. And so really he's saying that human beings are fundamentally divorced from reality in the sense that we can't be sure what anything is outside of our own perception of it. And we're necessarily forced to perceive sense perceptions through these categories of thought, space and time, and the idea of cause and effect. But they're real. We can be certain, says Kant, that wherever we see physical objects colliding in the universe, they will obey Newton's laws of physics, not because Newton's laws of physics are necessarily universal truths of God's mind, but because human beings carry around in us these a priori categories of thought, which exist before any sense perceptions. They're the software, the programming of the human mind. So when I, see this pen and I look at it, I'm perceiving it in a context of space, enduring through time. But space isn't a sense perception, neither is time. So what this thing is in itself is impossible for me to know. All I know is whatever it is, after it's been filtered through these lenses of cognition, this is what I perceive. So that, I think, is a very every day you can just look out at the world and say, oh, you know, I'm just a byproduct of material atoms. But you should question, well, what is space and time? Am I just a conglomeration of atoms floating around in this soulless arena of empty space and time? Kant would say, no, space and time are projected from your own mind. You should reabsorb these projections and you'll see you're one with the universe. You are the source of the universe you perceive, because the universe is in a framework of space and time, which are lenses of the mind. Okay, so that is what Kant says, and Carl Jung will pick up from Kant and call those a priori categories of thought the archetypes of the collective unconscious mind. But I want to note that even though Kant was rejecting Plato's form of rationalism, he reverts to Plato's cosmology, at least in his metaphorical language. He says, and just in this transcendental or supersensible sphere, where empirical experience affords us neither instruction nor guidance, lie the investigations of reason, which, on account of their importance, we consider far preferable to and as having a far more elevated aim than all that the understanding can achieve within the sphere of sensuous phenomena. So I'll read a little bit of this again. He said, and just in this transcendental or supersensible sphere. So beyond the sensible spheres that you can perceive, that you can see, is the outermost sphere of the cosmos. We saw Plato talk about that in the Timaeus. We saw St. Augustine talk about that in the Confessions. And now Kant, after, despite giving Plato a hard time for abandoning empiricism, still, he's saying his search for these a priori categories of thought is in the more elevated super celestial transcendental sphere, which is that old Platonic image. And I'm saying that super celestial sphere is the cosmic horizon. It's described mathematically by Leonard Susskind's holographic string theory. And that is where the absolute ideas of the soul, all of them are imprinted on each point of that encompassing sphere, and they're all contained in the central point of the cosmos. And that what Carl Jung calls the collective unconscious mind can be correlated with this outermost horizon of the cosmos, where Jung himself experienced the past, the present, and the future of the whole universe, he said, so that all of the archetypes are interwoven with each other at each point of this outermost sphere from which they radiate inward. I was going to leave it at that, but I just remembered something I thought that was interesting about Kepler. Okay, so Kepler, who found the precise mathematical descriptions for Copernicus's heliocentric theory, nevertheless maintained the basic model of Augustine's Platonic cosmos. And this I got from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, taking the center for the Father, the spherical surface for the Son, and the intermediate space for the Holy Spirit. So the center is the gravitational singularity, the Big Bang. Kepler correlated the central point of the universe with God the Father. He equated God the Son, or Jesus Christ, with the outermost sphere, and we saw St. Augustine do the same thing. And then, interestingly, he calls the interior volume of the universe the Holy Spirit. If you're correlating Kepler's cosmological theology with Leonard Susskind's holographic string theory, the gravitational singularity of the Big Bang would be the God the Father, who also exists at the outermost sphere at each point, which is also where God the Son exists. All of the ideas of God's mind are there. And then that information, which contains the past, the present, and the future, radiates back in on these fundamental threads to create the holographic illusion of three-dimensional space. So that would seem to be the Holy Spirit, according to Kepler's theology. The elastic, rapidly vibrating threads that create this interior volume of space-time, I guess, would correlate to the Holy Spirit, according to Kepler. Okay, so in the next video, I'm going to show how Carl Jung worked with Wolfgang Pauli, and they both realized that they were re-engaging Plato's theory of the absolute ideas imprinted on the soul.